Okay, so the project at hand here is we're going to be replacing the forks on my 2014 Specialized rock hopper. The issue with these forks is that they are coil sprung and they only have 100 millimeters of travel on the stanchions. So they're no longer adequate for my skill level and writing style. We're going to be replacing them with these guys. These are the Suntour XCRs, XCR 32. So they offer an air sprung stanchion, and the stanchions are 32 millimeters in diameter compared to the 28 millimeters here on the XCTs. So we're going to get a little beefier stanchions. They're also 120 millimeter travel, so a little more travel. So it should be a decent upgrade all around the board. One thing I made sure of is to get a 1 1/8 inch straight steer tube. A lot of modern mountain bikes are now using a tapered steer tube, meaning it's wider at the bottom and it tapers up into the 1 1/8 inch. So that's the primary reason I picked these, is they will fit my mountain bike. The thing to notice is that these are still the 9 millimeter quick release axle style. Again, a lot of modern mountain bikes are going to be using the through axle style, which is completely different, will not be compatible with my current hub. So with that all noted, let's go ahead and get to work. Okay, so I got my bike mounted up here on the makeshift stand. I've gone ahead and removed the front and rear wheel just to make it a little lighter and a little easier to work on. So the first step is going to be removing the stem here and the handlebars. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, with that all undone, we should be able to go ahead and remove the fork now. So I've got a spacer here. I have a piece of cardboard down on the ground just so the concrete doesn't damage this fork, although to be honest I'm not too worried about it as I'm replacing it anyway. But we're still going to be careful here and not like bang directly on the steer tube. We'll use a piece of wood here. All right. Okay, so the fork is out. And the next step is going to be removing the bearing cups from the head tube here. I did go ahead and pick up a new headset assembly here. This is a Cane Creek ZS44. The ZS means zero stack, meaning that the bearings actually go into the bore of your head tube here, so they don't stick out, like a half inch or so like you'll see on older bikes or perhaps on road bikes. The reason I picked this up is I didn't want to reuse the hardware. You could reuse the hardware from the existing fork, but this came with the star-fangled nut, which I need for the steer tube, as well as the crown race for the fork. I didn't want to deal with pulling the crown race off the existing fork. There's a special tool that will make it easy for you. I didn't want to pay for it or deal with that, so I just brought this as a unit. This thing has sealed bearings, so those should be smoother and last longer on the inside as well. But first, let's go ahead and remove the bearing cups from the existing, from the head tube here. Okay, so for removing the bearing cups out of the head tube, we're going to be using a bearing cup removal tool. This is available from everyone's favorite blue-colored bike tool company, but because I'm only going to be doing this maybe once, I just went ahead and made my own for cheap. This is a piece of 3/4 inch electrical conduit that I cut about 5 inches down and then spread it out. So I'll go ahead and show you guys how this works now. Okay, so we'll take our tool and we'll kind of put it through backwards, because as we slide it up, those flanges will then snap into position there. just like that. And then now we can go ahead and hammer it out. So there's the bottom one out. Okay, I've gone ahead and turned my frame upside down. Hopefully this offers me a little bit better position. This is where it would be nice to have an actual bike stand where you could put it into whatever orientation you wanted. But let's see what we can do. All right, so that's out. Let's go ahead and do the bottom one first though, seeing as I already have it in this orientation. So I know this is the top, I'll set it aside. As the top. And here's our bottom. And here's what the bearings look like. As I mentioned, they're the sealed bearings. So they have this rubber seal that keeps the grease and all the components in there safe from dust and debris. Contrast that to the previous style, which are called caged ball bearings. And so these do a fine job, of course, but they are susceptible to dirt and grime getting their way in there. You might even be able to see, I can see some stuff that doesn't clearly belong in there, and that's gonna wear those bearings down, and so you're not gonna get a nice, perfect steering action eventually. And so these ones should hold up to time and wear a little bit better. I'm gonna apply grease both to the bearing itself here and to the bore of the head tube. That's just gonna make that squeeze in there nice, because it is an interference fit. It's going to be a tight fit. We're now ready to go ahead and press the cup in. So I'm using my homemade bearing cup press tool here. Simply a piece of half-inch or a half-inch threaded bolt with some fender washers here to provide support. So I'm taking care to make sure my washer is centered on the head tube. It's actually a perfect fit. I'm really happy with that. And then same up here, we want to make sure that's centered because we want this bearing cup to drive in evenly on all 360 degrees. We don't want to rack it and pinch it in either direction. So I'm just going to go slowly and easily on this, making sure it's driving in consistently on all sides. Okay, so I went ahead and wiped off the squeeze out grease, and at this point the bottom cup is now installed. It looks good, it's seated all the way around. So let's go ahead and do the top one now. It is the exact same process for the top one, so let's go through that quickly. Okay, so that went okay. I did struggle to get it off a little bit. If I was going to revise this tool, I'd probably go to a finer thread for a little more mechanical advantage. I did have to pull out the cheater bar to back that off. But it looks good. I didn't damage anything. That's what the tool here offers you, is not too much stress in any one point. So this still looks good. Okay, so let's switch gears back to the fork here. So now it's time to install the crown race. So the crown race looks like this, and it's going to get installed down onto the stereo tube here. So again, we're going to apply a little grease to help with the installation. So the homemade tool we've got for this one is my Crown Race setting tool. It's simply a piece of Schedule 40 1 1/4 inch PVC pipe with a cap on it so that I can hit it with a hammer. So let's see how this works. I've got a piece of wood here so I don't damage my axle there. Okay, so I'm still seeing a small gap here, but I'm assuming that is part of the design. I believe that might be part of the crown. It's equal all the way around, and I've struck it pretty hard. And so I'm gonna go ahead and call that good. The worst that can happen is that through riding, this thing's just gonna seat down further, and so I might just have to tighten up my star nut at the top here after a few rides, but this should be adequate. Okay, so now it's time to establish the length of our steer tube. They ship it with a nice long one so it'll fit pretty much any bike, but we're going to want to cut it down to fit our bike. So looking at this, I had this spacer in here before, however this top assembly is a lot taller than my previous one, so I'll probably move to a smaller spacer on this because I was happy with the height it was at. And if you wanted it taller or shorter, now would be your opportunity to do that, and you would just adjust your spacers. These come in a pack of varied heights, so you can dial that in. That's also why it's not you don't have to get the cut here super accurate. Just get it close enough and use your spacers to fine tune it. So my stem here is 30 millimeters tall, and this assembly here is about 140 millimeters tall. So I'll need a bare minimum of 170 millimeters. So I'll probably cut it a little longer. Remember, you can always cut shorter, but you cannot cut longer. And if you go too short, then you've catastrophically killed your fork there. So, okay, so I've got the fork clamped up here in my soft jaws to make it a little easier to work on here. So we're ready to cut the tube to length. Okay, so that looks good. Go ahead and clean that up with a file real quick. I am taking the time to clean this up with the vacuum and a rag. Those little chips that we got from cutting this, we don't want those anywhere near our bearing surfaces or bearing themselves. Those will destroy those quickly. So make sure we get this nice and clean. Okay, so now it's time to install the star nut, or also called the star-fangled nut. And it goes into the steer tube. And I have a little jig here. There is a dedicated tool for this, but I've just made it out of a socket. The bolt that you're going to use eventually to install it, and then the star-fangled nut threaded on there. So this gives us two things. It's going to set the depth correct to about 14 millimeters into the steer tube. And also this is going to ensure that I drive it perpendicular to the steer tube. We don't want it going in at an awkward angle where then it's not going to fit when it comes time for the actual installation. So with that said, let's get some grease on here to help with the installation, and we'll drive it home. So it was already trying to go in sideways. Had I not had this jig here, I'd be in danger of setting this crooked. But as I drive it in, the socket will meet with the top of the steer tube, and then it should be square. All right, so I screwed up and used an undersized socket. It was the biggest one I had. It was a little undersized. I did actually drive it into the steer tube a little bit. Not too bad. That's why I like to use the rubber mallet, so I can really feel what I'm working against there. And that's actually okay. My stack was a little undersized anyway, so now that star nut should be driven right in. Let's take a look. Okay, so as you can see, the nut is now set to the correct depth, and it's in there nice and square. Okay, so with our star nut set, we're about ready for the home stretch here. Let's go ahead and slide the lower bearing on. You can see how that rides on that crown race that we installed. This will then slip up through the head tube. Good enough. All right, now our top bearing goes in. And our, what do they call this? The top cover assembly. Okay, I had to fight that O-ring a little bit, but it's a good tight fit, which is what you want. So a little bit of grease and being careful with it, I was able to get that on. So we'll go ahead and seat everything down. Should fit nice and snug. So at this point you can see we have the steer tube coming out of the top of the stem. And this is undesirable because the action of tightening that bolt down to the star-fangled nut isn't going to accomplish anything. We want this top cap here to be pushing down onto the stem. So this is where our spacers come in. So as I said, I was using this 20 millimeter spacer, and we want it just to come up a little bit. It doesn't have to be much. So let's see if I've got a 15 millimeter should work nicely. So at 15 millimeters, you can see we got a little over 1/8 of an inch of space there, which should be just about right. So we'll remove the handlebars. Put the handlebar stem assembly back on, and as you can see there now, we have the steer tube coming up shy of the top of the stem. Make sure you do this before tightening the stem bolts. If you tighten the stem bolts first, then you won't get any tightening action as you bring this down. With the help of our jig we used, that went in perfectly. It's nice and square at a good depth. So I'll just get that snug to where I can now remove my bungee cord. So that's feeling pretty good. This is very easy to adjust later as well. It only involves this screw and these two bolts. So we'll just go ahead and call that good for now. Where it's at, we'll tighten up these two bolts here. Okay, so I got the wheels on and I went for a quick test ride, and this thing is awesome. The benefit for the air sprung forks with that extra, even just the 20 millimeters, which, well, is the same size as this spacer, it's unbelievable. It's night and day. I'm extremely pleased with this. So Like I said, I'll probably revisit the stem after a ride, make sure it's tightened down and everything, just if anything's worked its way into place, I'll check that over again. But as it stands, I'm calling this job complete. So thanks for watching, and hopefully you learned something.